To Infinity and Beyond, the Pixar IPO, a case study of historic entrepreneur Steve Jobs. August 1995, Palo Alto, California. Steve Jobs sat at his desk in his home office. He looked at his watch. 10 p.m. He rose from his chair and stepped to a window that faced the backyard. There were trees, a pool, flower beds, and a vegetable garden. He raised a window. It had been a typically hot day, but as usually happened at this time of the year, darkness brought a rapid fall in temperatures. He felt a gentle breeze and heard the rustling of leaves from the trees and the soft chirping of crickets. He had just finished a batch of emails with team members from Next. He founded Next in 1985 after he left Apple, or more accurately, after he'd been rather unceremoniously fired from the company he'd started with his friend Steve Wozniak. The thought of it all stung, even 10 years later. He remembered the headline from Businessweek: "The Fall of Steve Jobs, Apple's Turbulent Ride." Whatever. Now most of his time was spent working on Next. They started developing high-end computers for higher education and business markets. Their computers had gained critical acclaim, but ultimately didn't get much traction in terms of sales. So, 2 years earlier, Next had ceased hardware production and shifted to focus entirely on software development, rebranding its operating system from NextStep to OpenStep, a platform-independent environment. The operating system was innovative. It introduced several technologies that he'd started working on with the Macintosh at Apple. It had an object-oriented programming environment. It displayed PostScript for high-quality graphics, and the mock kernel operating system technology provided modularity, portability, and flexibility compared to the alternative, Microsoft Windows. Windows 95 had launched just this week. He didn't know what Microsoft's marketing spend on the launch was, but it had to be the biggest in software history. Microsoft was still trying to catch up to what he and his team had done with the Macintosh more than 10 years earlier. And Windows still just sat on top of DOS, which by now was a software hairball. At least the Rolling Stones got paid well for the use of their Start Me Up song for the ads. He returned to his desk. It was time to turn his attention to his second business, Pixar. He didn't spend as much time on it as Next, though he knew that would change in the next year. His history with Pixar also dated to 1985, but he'd purchased the business rather than starting it from scratch. He became interested in the burgeoning field of computer graphics while working on the Macintosh. He viewed technology developed by Lucasfilm's graphics group, owned then by George Lucas, as he aimed to improve graphics in his Star Wars films. He recognized that the technology was a possible game changer for multiple industries, including entertainment. So when Lucas had called him in 1985 to see if he was interested in buying the business, he jumped at the opportunity. Lucas was selling off assets for a divorce settlement. He'd paid him $5 million for the business and agreed to put another $5 million into it. He groaned to himself. That $5 million investment was now more than $40 million, his largest investment in anything. He needed to figure out some way to finance Pixar apart from his own pocketbook. He cashed in all but one share of his Apple stock when he'd left in 1985, but he was almost out of financial runway as the sole funder of Pixar. He picked up the phone to dial Lawrence Levy, Chief Financial Officer of Pixar. "Hey, Lawrence, glad you're still up." "I figured you'd call," Levy replied. He was used to it. "You're still thinking about an IPO?" "Yeah, I've been thinking more about Pixar's public offering. It could be unique. Sort of part Silicon Valley, part Hollywood. There's never been anything like it, a tech company, but in entertainment." "I think I understand where you're coming from," Steve Levy said, "but I wonder if investors can understand Pixar's business. And if they understand it, will they think it's an attractive investment? One of the things I learned from the Electronics for Imaging IPO was that investors prefer stability and predictability. I'm not sure Pixar will present a picture of either." Levy had been CFO at a firm, Electronics for Imaging, that had had an IPO. He'd learned how brutal investors could be when a business didn't deliver on growth and accurate forecasts. "Yeah, Lawrence, I get it. But that's investors' preference in the longer run. When it's in a new space, investors want to get in on the ground floor. When we did the Apple IPO, our forecasts were pure crap, but investors still wanted in." He thought back to the Apple IPO, which was in April 1980. They had sold shares at $22 apiece and raised $100 million, which was a lot of money for the company at that time. Pixar could use that much. Check that. Pixar could use more than $100 million. The first year of being a public company for Apple, he recalled, was difficult. They hadn't hit their forecast, and the stock price plunged about a third from early highs. But still, the IPO was like a rocket booster to Apple. It had provided a pile of cash to expand and further cemented the company's reputation as a pioneer in the personal computer market, which was so very new at that time. But from the moment of an IPO onward, the company is under tremendous scrutiny because its shares can be bought and sold by anyone. Gee, Steve, Levy said, when Apple did its IPO, it was on the front end of a new market, consumer purchased personal computers. Pixar is an entertainment, and that's been around for a long time. Disney went public in the 1950s, I think. But this is the intersection of entertainment and technology, Lawrence, and that's new. And I think the stock market is hungry for new. You've seen what the Netscape IPO did. Netscape was a venture capital-funded startup company that commercialized the first web browser. He and Lawrence had spent much time talking about the frontier opportunity the internet would create. Netscape had had their IPO this month, with the stock offered initially at $28 per share. It was trading at something like $60 per share already. I think the IPO for Pixar can be bigger than Netscape. Netscape's market cap is over $1 billion, Levy exclaimed. I can dream of the day. So can I, Lawrence. He owned almost all of the company, though Levy had been after him to form an options program for employee ownership. We should move on developing the plan for a Pixar public offering, Lawrence. Let's make it happen. August 1996, Emeryville, California. Steve Jobs sat at the end of a conference table at Pixar's office. To his right were Brian Bean, Todd Carter, and Keith Benjamin from Robertson Stevens, an investment banking firm from San Francisco. To his left were Ed Catmull, Lawrence Levy, and Sarah Staff from Pixar. The conference room was nothing remarkable, but it still reflected Pixar. Each of the walls was a different color, and there was artwork of toys related to the Toy Story characters throughout. He let Pixar creativity come from Pixar people, but given that this room is where they brought in outsiders, he'd spent time working on its design. He was the one paying the bills, after all. The meeting was about the potential engagement of Robertson Stevens as an investment banker for a Pixar IPO. Their need for an investment bank was because their role in bringing together those who have money, investors, with those who need it, Pixar. For Pixar to go public, they needed an investment banker serving as an intermediary. He didn't like gatekeepers of anything, but investment bankers guarded the pathways to money. Money that Pixar needed desperately if it was to become what he hoped. It would help his personal balance sheet, too. The discussion was good so far, but the fact that the discussion was even occurring was not. They had held meetings of a similar nature with Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, the two most illustrious investment banking firms. He had thought he had some clout from having been a part of the Apple IPO, but it wasn't enough to get either of those two firms to the finish line. They both said no to working on the Pixar IPO. He told both Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley he was offering him a chance to be part of one of the hottest IPOs of the year. Their dog and pony show presentation in the same conference room depicted Pixar's vision, business plan, and the risk associated with making that plan a reality. Pixar was going to do in the 1990s what Disney had done in the 1930s. It would be a new era of animated entertainment that would take advantage of a new technology for storytelling. The technology plus the storytelling talent of Pixar would create iconic films and characters that would be worldwide brands. They showed off the renderings of different scenes from Toy Story, always capped by the final chase sequence, which because of the movement and the changing outdoor scenery was incredibly difficult to make, but stunning to see. "This is incredible," Frank Quattrone from Morgan Stanley had said. "I had no idea the level of this artistry that was happening here." The initial discussions had seemed to go well with both Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs, but neither proceeded beyond light due diligence. First, Goldman Sachs had turned them down. They thought Pixar needed to first renegotiate the Disney contract for more films. They had it exactly backwards. They needed the money and the profile from an IPO to be able to have the leverage to get Disney to renegotiate. Even investment bankers could be bozos sometimes. Then Quattrone from Morgan Stanley had called him. He'd been stunned to be turned down by him, too. Something about the unpredictability of hit films was the primary reason. Ed had just explained to the investment bankers where Toy Story was. The release date was November 22nd, the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, a prime release date. There were still many 20-hour days for the many people on this Toy Story team to get to that date, but the line of sight was clear. The release date was a go. Now it was his turn to pick up the story. We're aiming at Pixar to change entertainment history in a way few companies have ever had the chance to do. We have 4 pillars that it will take to make our vision work. He moved his eyes to each one of the 3 people from the investment bank. And Robertson Stephens can be a big part of Pixar achieving that vision. Pillar number 1 is that we raise the money to finance our films. It was big for Pixar to have Disney finance Toy Story, our first film, but we need to be able to finance the films ourselves. The IPO that you'll lead for Pixar will provide those funds. Pillar 2 is that we use the funds from the IPO to expand the studio. We need to be able to develop and work on more than one film at a time. Great films take time, but more releases lead to more profits. Pillar 3 is to make Pixar a worldwide brand. Disney is the only major brand in animated films, but we'll change that. Pillar 4 arises from the first 3. Increase Pixar's share of film profits. We can do that if we have the funds to finance our own films. And as we leverage the Pixar brand, that'll happen with the Toy Story release to negotiate a much different deal with Disney. What about the risk? Asked Todd Carter from Robertson Stephens. It seems like a number of dominoes need to fall just right to make this all work. He'd known this would be a question. Both Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley had pinned their turning down the Pixar IPO opportunity because of what they called the riskiness of the project. That's right, Todd. There are risks, big ones. Wall Street is going to need to understand them. Our idea is to face questions about the risk head on, and I know you can help us with that. The thing we need to help investors understand is the risk-reward story. Yes, the risks are more substantial than some IPOs, but you know what? So are the rewards, the upside. The unique technology capabilities of Pixar will be obvious to anyone who sees 1 minute of Toy Story. But what will be obvious to the millions who watch the whole film is the storytelling capabilities of the team that Ed and John have assembled here at Pixar. The technology behind Pixar films has been a long time in development, but the real labor is in the stories. We worked 4 years on Toy Story. The first year and a half was all story development. And now we have a film that, of course, kids will love, but what you'll see is that teenagers and parents will love it too. You know, Snow White is a 60-year-old film. It was the first animated feature film. Who do you know that hasn't seen Snow White? I know many people in many different parts of the world, and I don't think I know one person who hasn't seen Snow White. So the ability of these things to live for 60 or even 100 years is amazing. And that's very different than the technology world that I come from. You know, most of the technology products we do, Apple IIs, Macintoshes, you name it, you're lucky if they live 10 or 15 years. Almost all the technologies become part of the sediment layer of the next technologies are built upon. Films can live for 100 years. It's a very different business. And we're not competing against, a Microsoft or another company. We're competing against whether we can make a great film that people love. The discussion then moved onto the financial stakes of an IPO for Pixar. 2 numbers were important. Number 1 was box office receipts on the weekend of Toy Story's release. Disney told them they could make a good prediction of the overall performance of the film based on numbers from the opening weekend. By the Saturday after Thanksgiving, they would know. He was aiming for a $15 to $20 million opening weekend. That kind of number would indicate that the overall performance would exceed $100 million, putting Toy Story among the top performing films of the year. Only 4 animated films had ever exceeded $100 million in North American ticket sales: Aladdin, Beauty and the Beast, The Lion King, and Pocahontas. All were Disney films. Naturally, Disney was skeptical of that sort of prediction. How could a Pixar film perform at a level above Disney animations? They couldn't believe such an idea, but they would. Large corporations could be such boneheads, or the people inside them could be. The meeting ended and everyone rose from their seats. "Thank you for taking us through the Pixar story," Brian Bean said sincerely. "Congratulations on getting close to the finish line on Toy Story. I look forward to taking my family to see it." Patience wasn't his thing, so he pushed. Thank you, guys. This is going to be a great partnership, and it'll be one of the great IPOs, but we need to move. Bean shook his head. Got it, Steve. Here's the process for our decision. We'll build a case for the project, and then we'll take it to the commitment committee. He cut him off. A committee? God. Bean laughed. Probably bad branding, Steve. It won't take that long to give you a yes or a no. We'll complete our recommendation in the next 2 days and aim to meet at the commitment committee next week. They usually decide same day. That's good, Brian. Can you give us the odds of a yes? Todd Carter answered for the investment bankers after an uncomfortable few moments. I think it'll be close, he said. Wednesday, November 29th, 1996, San Francisco, California. Steve Jobs looked out at San Francisco from a high vantage, the skyscraper office of Robertson Stephens in the downtown financial district. Dawn was just beginning to break, and the streets below were relatively quiet, with only early commuters moving about. There was some fog, making the view of the skyline seem kind of dreamlike. He didn't have to drive here very often, thank God. The commute from Palo Alto could be awful. But he'd arrived 30 minutes ago, about 6:30 a.m., ahead of the morning traffic's worst time. An awful early morning is a trade for an awful commute. What a trade. He hadn't been able to sleep anyway. Today was the day, the Pixar IPO. Last Wednesday had been Pixar's premiere. He'd been at home on Saturday morning when he received a call from Sarah's staff with the projection of how the film would perform on its opening weekend in ticket sales. Sarah's contact at Disney had just delivered the news that she would pass to him. How are the numbers, Sarah? He listened for a minute before putting down his phone. Lorene was across the kitchen table from him. He smiled and shook his head. It's huge. Disney's projecting Toy Story will do $30 million this weekend. $30 million! Wow, she said. That's higher than you even hoped, isn't it? Yeah, I thought it would be big, but you never really know. Disney also does some polling of consumers, and they think it will keep getting bigger. They're thinking ticket sales will easily go past $150 million and run towards $200 million. He exhaled. This is massive. Toy Story could be bigger than Batman Forever and Apollo 13. Those were the two biggest movies of the year, both moving toward $200 million in ticket sales. Tom Hanks is having a pretty big year, he chuckled. Hanks starred as astronaut Jim Lovell in Apollo 13 and was the voice of Woody in Toy Story. Lorene smiled at this. I think Steve Jobs is having a pretty big year too. A movie debut in November with the biggest film of the year, and next week, a Pixar IPO that will be massive, he said. Massive. The first 2 days of the week, he'd spoken often to the investment bankers at Robertson Stephens as they used the early Toy Story numbers to settle on the offering price of Pixar's shares in the IPO. They had spent time starting in October on their road show, a series of presentations Steve, Ed, John, and Lawrence had done in preparation for Pixar going public. The purpose of the presentations was to generate interest and attract potential investors to purchase shares of Pixar when it became publicly traded. Today. The investment bankers had been thinking of $12 to $14 per share as the proposed price prior to the meeting with investors. But after the meeting, the feedback had been so positive from investment fund managers that they decided to aim for $22 a share. That share price pegged the value of Pixar at $800 million and meant they could raise $140 million to finance future films. In the room were Ed and Lawrence from Pixar, and Todd Carter, Mike McCaffrey, Brian Bean, and Ken Fitzsimmons from Robertson Stephens. Fitzsimmons was the one working on a computer to launch trading of Pixar. Fitzsimmons was in charge of actually placing the stock in the hands of investors. Pixar would trade on the NASDAQ stock exchange, which is an electronic stock exchange. So the computer screen was projected onto a screen at the front of the room. The 6 million shares of Pixar stock had been placed with investors at $22 per share, but now they could be purchased by others and sold. Todd Campbell stood by the screen and pointed. There it is, he exclaimed. Pixar's first trade. He pointed toward the stock symbol PIXR. But the price next to the stock symbol was not $22, the price first investors paid before opening the stock to public trade. They watched for the next 30 minutes as the price moved upward. By 7:30 a.m., it was at more than $35 per share. They all just sat there, kind of dumbfounded. Todd Carter broke the silence, turning to him. "Congratulations, Steve," he said. "You're a billionaire." "To infinity and beyond" is the stock line for Toy Story character Buzz Lightyear, voiced by Tim Allen. It seems apt, too, for where Steve Jobs found himself professionally in late 1996. Many rank Jobs as one of history's greatest entrepreneurs, me included. But to fully appreciate what he would do at Pixar and Apple between 1996 and his death in 2011, you need to understand how much of that later impact rested on a knife's edge. When Jobs had been forced out of Apple in 1985, he'd sold all but one share of his stock in the company, harvesting for himself something just above $100 million. That's significant money, sure, but by 1995 he'd sunk most of that into his two businesses, Next and Pixar. He was nowhere near to being on the billionaires list. Not even close. Pixar stock closed its first day of trading on that November day in 1996 at $39 per share. That gave Pixar a market value of nearly $1.5 billion and put Jobs, very suddenly, in the billionaires club. Lawrence Levy, CFO at Pixar at the time, and author of the book To Pixar and Beyond, My Unlikely Journey with Steve Jobs to Make Entertainment History, commented that at some point during that first day Pixar stock traded, Jobs had called his friend Larry Ellison, founder and CEO of Oracle, and said, "Larry, I made it." Made it indeed. But there were still doubts about Pixar. The Wall Street Journal headline from the day following the IPO was, "Steve Jobs is back in the saddle again, becoming a billionaire in Pixar IPO." From the article, quote, "There are plenty of analysts who think the market's valuation of Pixar at a total of $1.46 billion is a sign of investors gone mad. Disney will get 80% to 90% of the revenue from Toy Story and lock Pixar into a 3-picture deal through at least 1999 that promises to be a lot more rewarding for Disney than Pixar." End quote. Toy Story went on to become the biggest film of 1995, with a domestic box office of $192 million and a global box office of $365 million. But what would come to fruition was much of Jobs' vision. The success of Toy Story far exceeded anything Disney expected. Computer animation was considered an experiment by many at Disney before Toy Story was released. No more. Computer animation wouldn't be a sideshow. Disney didn't have to renegotiate its deal with Pixar, but they needed to be more open to keeping Pixar happy. There were twists and turns in the renegotiation, of course, but by February 1997, a new co-production agreement between Walt Disney Company and Pixar Animation Studio was signed. Pixar got the 50% share of profits they aimed for and the latitude to develop the Pixar brand. The New York Times reported on the deal. Quote, "The Walt Disney Company announced an unusual 10-year partnership yesterday with Pixar Animation Studios to jointly make 5 films in a deal that reflects the value Hollywood increasingly places on the lucrative field of animated movies. Disney and the fledgling studio will equally share the cost, profits, and the logo credit of the 5 films." End quote. Of course, Pixar would go on to become a hit film juggernaut. The first 10 films, Toy Story, A Bug's Life, Toy Story 2, Monsters, Inc., Finding Nemo, The Incredibles, Cars, Ratatouille, WALL-E, and Up, collectively grossed billions of dollars worldwide and received numerous awards and nominations, establishing Pixar as a leading animation studio renowned for its storytelling, innovation, and technical excellence. But before those first 10 films were completed, in 2006, Disney would acquire Pixar for $7.4 billion. The all-stock deal would leave Steve Jobs as the biggest individual shareholder in Disney. Back to February 1997. It was a big month for Steve Jobs for more than the renegotiated Disney-Pixar deal. That same month, he also sold Next to Apple for $429 million. Given that Jobs had started Next, at least somewhat in rebellion for being let go by Apple, there was some irony in the acquisition. He intended the next software to be the core of a new generation operating system for Apple, and that would happen. Apple used the Next Step operating system as the basis for what would become the Mac OS. This operating system laid the groundwork for iOS, which powers your iPhones and iPads today. The acquisition of Next and its technology was a pivotal moment in Apple's history. It was a pivotal moment for Steve Jobs, too. The Pixar IPO put him on the billionaires list. The Next acquisition by Apple put him back at the center of the computer industry, as well as further up in the billionaires rankings. And he was re-engaged with the company he'd founded, Apple. It's hard to imagine now, but you see, Apple was in deep trouble in 1997. The company lost $1 billion that year and was nearing the point of financial failure. The spring and summer of 1997, Jobs entered into a very delicate dance with Ed Woolard, Apple board chairman, on coming back to Apple in some capacity. Looking back, it's too easy today to say that Jobs' triumphant return to Apple was preordained, because it wasn't. Jobs had real hesitation to the idea of returning to Apple, but by July 1997, he'd agreed to come back as an uncompensated advisor after the board fired CEO Gil Amelio. Steve Jobs wrestling with the idea of returning to Apple is a great case study in and of itself. You can learn about the rest of that story when I publish my book, The Entrepreneur's Ethic. Steve Jobs exemplifies Ethic 5 of The Entrepreneur's Ethic, be the real you. This is the authenticity orientation of entrepreneurship. Know thyself is an aphorism that reaches back to ancient Greek philosophy. Wisdom is understanding yourself, but also being able to adapt to most situations and circumstances. The Steve Jobs who took Pixar public in 1996 and came back to Apple in 1997 was an improved version of the man who'd been booted from Apple in 1985. Not a perfect executive or person for sure, but improved in ways that tapped the deeper strengths he possessed. Jobs' ability to focus and to inspire and drive others to do creative work were all manifestations of his personality he learned to use with greater effectiveness as he gained experience. Jobs learned a lot about how to be a more effective leader at Pixar. Ed Catmull, who worked with Jobs for 26 years as president of Pixar, wrote about this in his book, Creativity, Inc. He noted how Jobs changed profoundly between 1985, when he bought Pixar, to when he died in 2011. Quoting the book, "The word genius is used a lot these days, too much I think. But with Steve, I actually think it was warranted. Still, when I first came to know him, he was frequently dismissive and brusque. This is the part of Steve that people love to write about. I realize that it's difficult to understand people who deviate so radically from the norm, like Steve did, and I suspect that those who focus on his more extreme traits do so because those traits are entertaining and revealing in some way. He got smarter about when to stop pushing people and how to keep pushing them, if necessary, without breaking them. He became fairer and wiser, and his understanding of partnership deepened, in large part because of his marriage to Lorene and his relationships with the children he loved so much. This shift didn't lead him to abandon his famous commitment to innovation, it solidified it. At the same time, he developed into a kinder, more self-aware leader, and I think Pixar played a role in that development." End quote. Jobs was and is rightfully recognized for his great sense of design. This came through in Pixar films and Apple products surely, but also in personal ways. A person who worked with Jobs wrote the following, quote, "He wore a Porsche wristwatch, again chosen because he was so in awe of the museum-quality design. Whenever anyone noticed the watch and admired it, Steve would take it off his wrist and present it as a gift, a way of saying, 'Congratulations on recognizing excellent design.' Minutes later, he would have an identical one on his wrist again. He kept a box of them in his office so he could give them away, around $2,000 a piece." End quote. In my experience, good design arises from the morphing of complex messiness to the simple. It seems kind of backwards, but most of the time early prototypes of a product are complicated and messy. But as the design process proceeds, if it's good, it becomes more streamlined, elegant, and simple. And the most complicated thing in the entire universe is you. Not a machine, microbe, plant, animal, continent, planet, or star, but you. Human beings are an amazing piece of biological complexity, sure, but then there's these things people possess called consciousness and imagination that we, at least scientifically, do not understand at all. Becoming the real you is about morphing your complexity into simplicity. Steve Jobs designed not only great user interfaces for Apple products, but a user interface for himself. The early versions of Jobs had lots of glue, duct tape, and loose wires. The later versions had a much better design, a much better user interface. And that's what each of us needs to do as time and experience shapes us. Create that better designed user interface for others and the world to interact with. Ethic 5, be the real you.